The radio had been silent for 11 hours. Not quiet, silent. There is a difference, and anyone who has spent time in the Amazon understands it viscerally. The jungle is never quiet. It breathes and screams and clicks and drips constantly. A wall of sound so dense it becomes its own kind of silence after a while. But the radio, the single thread connecting 6 researchers to the outside world, had gone dead sometime around 3 a.m. on the 4th day, and no one had spoken about it yet, because speaking about it would make it real. Dr. Mara Solano pressed the receiver again. Static. She turned the dial. More static. Outside the tent, rain hammered the canopy in sheets, and somewhere in the dark, the Javari River was rising. She could hear it, that low, ominous surge beneath everything else, the sound of water finding new places to go. And she was standing in 8 inches of mud. Her left boot had split at the sole 2 days ago. She hadn't slept in 36 hours. And the 6 people depending on her had no idea how badly their situation had just changed. What brought them here, what brought any of them here, was science. Curiosity. The same impulse that has always pushed human beings into places that don't want them. That impulse almost killed every single one of them. Dr. Mara Solano was 38 years old when she assembled the team that would define the rest of her life. A botanical ethnographer at the University of São Paulo, she had spent 15 years studying the medicinal plant knowledge of Amazonian indigenous communities, publishing papers that earned her respect in narrow academic circles and near zero recognition anywhere else. She was methodical, a patient, and quietly brilliant in the way that people who are genuinely good at something often are, without needing anyone to know it. The expedition was her idea, her grant, her obsession. A remote corridor of the Val do Javari, a region of western Amazonia roughly the size of Austria, most of it legally protected, almost none of it mapped at biological resolution, had been identified in satellite imagery as containing an unusually dense concentration of a plant genus called Uncaria, several species of which produce compounds with documented anti-inflammatory properties. Indigenous healers in the region had referenced something they called cipo de fogo, fire vine, in oral histories, and Mara believed this was a specific, potentially undocumented species. She had been trying to get funding for this trip for 4 years. The team she built was small by design. Rafael Monteiro, 44, a field botanist who had worked in the Amazon for 2 decades and moved through dense jungle the way most people move through familiar rooms. Isabella Tran, 29, a doctoral student in ecology who had grown up in Manaus and knew the forest in a personal, almost ancestral way. Tomas Braga, 51, a photographer and documentarian who had covered crises on 4 continents and whose steady presence in difficult situations Mara had witnessed once before during a difficult field season in Pará. And 2 local guides, brothers named Quiro and Davi Ferreira, both from a riverside community near Atalaia do Norte, both of whom knew this stretch of river better than anyone outside the indigenous territories that bordered it. 6 people, 42 days. A route that would take them 60 kilometers into the forest by river, then another 30 overland. It was, on paper, ambitious but manageable. The Ferreiras had done similar routes. Rafael had done harder ones. The equipment was good. The dry season, June through October, was precisely why Mara had scheduled the expedition for August. The rains would be minimal. The rivers would be lower, calmer, easier to navigate. What they didn't know was that 2019 was not a normal year for the Javari Basin. And what no satellite image could tell them was what the forest floor looked like after months of unusual weather had moved through that corridor like a slow catastrophe. It was the kind of thing that seemed fine, right up until it wasn't. They reached their base camp coordinates on day 3, and everything still seemed fine. Mercero had noted quietly that the river level was higher than he expected for August. Not alarming, but notable. He mentioned it to Davi, and Davi shrugged in the way that people shrug when something bothers them, but they can't yet explain why. Neither of them said anything to Mara, partly because it wasn't yet a problem, and partly because the river being slightly high in August was unusual, but not unprecedented. On the morning of day 4, Tomas woke at 5:30 a.m. to photograph the pre-dawn light and found his equipment cases floating. Not floating dramatically, just slightly, lifted off the tarp by perhaps 2 centimeters of water that had crept into the camp overnight. He stood there for a moment, looking at it, and then went to wake Cairo. By 7 a.m., the camp was moving. They broke everything down efficiently and relocated 40 meters upslope, rebuilt. It cost them most of the morning. By the time they had re-established, the rain that had been threatening since dawn had arrived in earnest, not the brief fierce downpours of normal Amazon afternoons, but a sustained gray deluge, the kind that doesn't look dramatic but saturates everything within hours. "It'll pass," Raphael said, and he believed it, because in 20 years of fieldwork, the rain had always passed. It didn't pass. For 31 hours, it rained without stopping. By the morning of day 5, the Javari had risen 1.4 meters, the tributary they had planned to follow inland, a narrow blackwater stream named on no official map, now known to the Ferreiras only by a local word meaning roughly the one with white herons, had transformed from a navigable creek into a brown torrent that was actively moving trees. Their planned overland route, which began at the confluence of that stream with the main river, was now submerged under at least a meter of floodwater for an indeterminate distance. Mara looked at the GPS, then at the river, then at Cairo. "How long until it recedes?" she asked. Cairo looked at the sky. "Days, maybe a week, maybe more." This was the decision that would define everything, rather than waiting, which felt like failing, like giving up the expedition she had fought 4 years to fund. Mara proposed they attempt a parallel route, further upslope, following a ridgeline that Davy believed he remembered from a hunting trip years earlier. It would be harder going, longer, less certain, but it would keep the expedition alive. Everyone agreed. It seemed like the reasonable response to an inconvenient problem. The ridgeline Davy remembered did not exist, or rather, it existed, but the hunting trip he was remembering had been somewhere else entirely, a different river, a different year, collapsed in memory into a false certainty. By the end of day 6, they were lost. In the Amazon, lost is not a single moment. It's a process. It begins with the quiet, mutual acknowledgement, not spoken aloud at first, that you are no longer certain where you are. The GPS coordinates still work. The problem is that GPS tells you where you are, not what is between you and where you need to be. And what was between the team and any recognizable landmark was approximately 30 kilometers of primary forest, cross-cut by ridges and streams that Mara's topographic maps, printed from satellite data, never ground-truthed, showed with confident lines that bore no reliable relationship to what they were actually standing in front of. Cairo made the correct call on the morning of day 7. Stop moving, signal for help, activate the emergency locator beacon, and wait. He activated the beacon at 8:14 a.m. The beacon malfunctioned. The LED indicator showed green, operational, but no signal was being transmitted. They would not discover this until much later. At the time, they believed they had been heard, and that belief, oddly, made the next 48 hours more dangerous, not less, because it made them wait instead of moving toward the river. The rain continued. The temperature dropped to 19 degrees Celsius at night. Not cold by most standards, but in wet clothing, with no dry shelter and caloric reserves beginning to thin. 19 degrees feels like something else entirely. Isabella developed a cough on day 8. By day 9, it had moved into her chest. Tomas, who had covered disasters, said nothing but began photographing with more urgency, as if the act of documenting could hold something at bay. And Mara, in the tent she shared with Isabella, sat with the dead radio and the malfunctioning beacon and began, for the first time, to calculate. 6 people, 14 days of food, half consumed, an unknown distance from the river. 1 person already sick. No working communications. Flooding that showed no sign of abating. She ran the numbers twice. Then she put the notebook away and focused on what she could control. That, more than anything, is the skill that survival requires. Not strength, not even resourcefulness, but the discipline to close the door on the thoughts that will hollow you out and put your hands on the next concrete task. The next concrete task was building a better shelter. She woke Raphael at midnight and they worked until 3 a.m., and by morning they had something that actually kept the rain out. It wasn't hope, but it was something to do with their hands. What the mind does under sustained stress is, in some ways, more interesting than what the body does. The body's responses are mechanical. It burns reserves, loses muscle mass, slows cognition to protect core functions. These things happen on a schedule, like a machine running down, and the mind is less predictable. By day 10, Davy had stopped speaking, not from illness, but from a kind of guilt that had turned inward and gone silent. He was the one who had misremembered the ridge, and though no one blamed him, he blamed himself with a ferocity that made conversation impossible. He sat at the edge of camp each morning and looked at the forest in a way that Mara found frightening. Raphael dealt with it differently. He became hyper-competent, cataloging every plant within a 200-meter radius, identifying edibles, organizing equipment with a precision that bordered on obsessive. It was his way of not thinking about his wife and 2 children in Belém. He had left them without much ceremony, as he always did, because expeditions were normal for him and drama at departure felt like bad luck. Now he regretted the lack of ceremony. He regretted it specifically and physically, the way you regret something you can feel in your chest. Isabella's cough worsened. By day 11, it was clear she had a respiratory infection, not yet pneumonia, but moving in that direction. They had antibiotics in the medical kit. Tomas, who had been trained in field medicine for his documentary work, made the call to start her on amoxicillin. It was the right call, but it meant the antibiotics were now gone if anyone else needed them. Mara's own interior state was harder to read, even for her. She noticed that she had begun, at odd moments, to have vivid sensory memories of her childhood home in Porto Alegre. The smell of her mother's kitchen, the particular sound of a specific gate hinge, the texture of a concrete step she used to sit on in the afternoons. The brain, she understood intellectually, retreats to safety when safety isn't available. She let the memories come. She didn't fight them. She used them. There was one night, day 12, when she sat outside after midnight, in a brief pause in the rain, and looked up through a gap in the canopy at a sky that was, for the first time in days, showing stars. The Southern Cross. She knew it well. She had navigated by it as a teenager on a sailing trip with her father. The sight of it, familiar, unchanged, completely indifferent to her situation, broke something open in her that she hadn't known was closed. She cried for about 4 minutes. Then she went back inside and woke Raphael because she had an idea. The idea was the river, and they had been trying to navigate toward a specific point. their extraction coordinate, where the boat should have been waiting. But the boat had certainly left by now. What she needed wasn't a specific point. She needed any point on the river, any point at all, because the river connected to everything else. And rivers, unlike ridgelines, are findable by logic. Water flows downhill, and if you follow drainage, you find water. It sounds obvious. It is obvious. But obvious things become invisible when you are frightened and exhausted and fixated on a plan that is no longer viable. She had been so focused on where she was supposed to go that she had stopped thinking about the fundamental geography of where she actually was. They began moving on day 13. Cairo took the lead, because moving through dense undergrowth toward water was something he could do in a state of exhaustion that would have paralyzed most people. The strategy was pure. Find the lowest ground, follow it. When water pooled, follow it downhill, keep moving. The forest at this point in the wet season was not merely difficult to move through, it was actively, almost personally, hostile. The flooding had displaced ground-level fauna. Snakes that would normally be in leaf litter were in low branches, which meant every step required looking not just down but up and sideways. Fire ants had colonized anything above the waterline, including several logs they attempted to use for rest. Isabella, weak from her infection but medicated and mobile, Nors moved in the center of the group with a concentration that Mara would later describe as heroic, putting one foot in front of the other, hour after hour, with no complaint. On day 13, they covered perhaps 4 kilometers. It took 9 hours. On day 14, they hit a problem no one had anticipated: a natural dam, a massive tangle of fallen trees and debris, perhaps 40 meters wide, 3 meters high, blocking the drainage channel they were following. The water backed up behind it had formed a stagnant lake covering several hectares. They could not cross it. They could not go around it easily. Going around it to the left meant climbing a steep, unstable slope still saturated from weeks of rain. Going around to the right meant entering an area of standing water with no visibility of the bottom. Tomas was the one who solved it, not through expertise, but through the kind of lateral thinking that desperation sometimes produces. He proposed they go over the dam. Not through it, over it, crawling across the tangle of logs and debris on top, testing each handhold before weighting it, moving one person at a time while the others spotted from below. It took 4 hours. Davi fell once, through a gap between 2 logs, plunging to his waist in the dark water beneath the debris pile, and was pulled out by Cairo in a moment of physical and emotional intensity that seemed to break something loose in Davi. He came out of the water shaking and laughing, which is what terror looks like when it releases, and for the first time in 5 days, he spoke in full sentences. They were on the far side of the dam by late afternoon. The drainage channel resumed, wider now. I'm moving faster. Mara smelled something different in the air, a particular quality of openness, the way the light changed. She didn't say anything. She was afraid to be wrong. But what happened next was something none of them had allowed themselves to fully believe in. At 6:47 a.m. on day 15, Cairo broke through a wall of heliconia and stopped so abruptly that Mara walked into his back. He was standing on a mud bank at the edge of a river. Not the Javari, a tributary, unnamed, perhaps 30 meters wide, running fast and brown with floodwater, but a river, open sky above it. And there, so surreal it took 3 seconds to process, a motorized canoe, moving upstream, perhaps 200 meters away. Cairo started screaming. He screamed the way people scream when sound has been building for 15 days without a release valve, raw and absolute and completely undignified. Raphael joined him. Tomas fired a flare, one of 2 remaining flares from the kit, the only truly reliable signal they had left. The canoe didn't stop immediately. and for one terrible moment it seemed like they hadn't been seen. Then it turned. The man operating the canoe was a rubber tapper named Seu Benedito, 67 years old, who made this particular upstream run once every 3 weeks to check his tapping sites. He had heard the yelling before he saw the flare, the sound carrying across the water in a way it wouldn't have through the forest. And he had slowed instinctively, the way you slow when something in the environment is wrong. He pulled the canoe to the bank and looked at 6 people who appeared, as he would later tell a journalist, like the forest itself had been wearing them. His canoe was too small for 6. He had a small 2-way radio that reached a relay station 40 kilometers downriver. He made the call, left them with 2 days of food from his own provisions, and promised to send a larger boat back. It arrived 11 hours later. All 6 of them were on it. All 6 were alive. The medical evaluations in Atalaya do Norte were exhaustive. Isabella's respiratory infection had stopped short of pneumonia, but would require 2 weeks of antibiotics to fully clear. Rafael had lost 9 kilograms. Mara had lost 7. Davy had a laceration on his leg from the fall through the dam that required stitches and showed early signs of infection. Tomas, now characteristically, had documented the entire ordeal on approximately 1,400 photographs, the last of which, taken on the morning of day 15, showed the team moving through the forest in single file, backlit by a shaft of early light, every one of them visibly destroyed and visibly moving forward. That photograph would later be used as the cover image for a paper Mara published in 2021, not the botanical study she had intended to write, but something different. A detailed account of decision-making failures in field expedition planning, co-authored with a wilderness medicine specialist, aimed specifically at the academic research community. The paper recommended mandatory satellite communication redundancy for expeditions beyond 15 kilometers from navigable water. It was not a dramatic document. It was dry, methodical, specific. It has been downloaded over 40,000 times. The malfunctioning beacon was traced to a manufacturing defect in a batch of units that had been distributed to multiple research institutions. The manufacturer issued a recall. 6 other expeditions, it turned out, had been operating equipment from the same batch. For those 6 teams, they were lucky. They hadn't needed the beacon yet. Davi Ferreira never guided another deep forest expedition. He still lives near Atalaya do Norte, still works the river. He does not speak much about what happened, but people who know him say he keeps a photograph on his wall, taken by Tomas on the morning they found the river. He is in the foreground, chest deep in floodwater, being pulled out by his brother, and he is laughing. There is a question worth sitting with after a story like this one. Not how did they survive? That question has answers. Cairo's navigation, Tomas's lateral thinking at the dam, Mara's capacity to close the door on the thoughts that would have undone her and focus on what her hands could do. The logic of following water downhill, which is so simple it sounds almost insulting until you remember that they were exhausted and wet and frightened, and obvious things stop being obvious under those conditions. The harder question is, why does this keep happening? Why do careful, experienced, intelligent people keep walking into situations that become catastrophic? And the answer, if there is one, is that the Amazon does not care about careful or experienced or intelligent. It is not a place that meets you where you are. It is a place that simply is what it is, indifferent, enormous, operating according to its own logic at scales that dwarf human planning, which is not an argument against going. It is an argument for going honestly, with enough humility to know what you don't know, enough redundancy to survive what you can't predict, and enough trust in the people beside you to say out loud when something feels wrong. Cairo noticed the river was high on day 1. He didn't say anything. That detail haunted Mara for years. Not as blame, She has said clearly that it wasn't Cairo's fault, that the dynamic of expedition hierarchies makes that kind of communication difficult, that the paper she and her colleague wrote was partly an attempt to address exactly that silence. But as a reminder, the jungle doesn't swallow teams. Teams walk into the jungle carrying small silences, small uncertainties, small decisions to not quite say the thing that needs saying. And then the rain comes. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think about risk or communication or what it means to depend completely on the people beside you, share it with someone. Leave a comment. And if you want more stories like this one, we put one out every week. The forest is still out there. People are still going in. Some of them come back.